Our tutorial scene is looking good, so let's go ahead and bring in a couple of the parts and pieces we're going to need for this. And the main part that we're going to need is the additional actor, our Goomba. So let's go into our prefabs. And if we go down to our prefab player and Goomba, we're going to find the player that we're going to need. We can see him in the preview right there. He's our cute little Goomba. Let's go ahead and drag him and drop him into our hierarchy. And we can see him inside the view here. We can just drag him up and over. We'll get him set up and ready to start using. We can see the position here. If we go into a perspective view, we'll probably notice that he's going to be offset from our world blocks. So let's go ahead and just set him back to a 0, 0, 0 plane and then get him started. And we'll just drag him back up and over. What we want to do while we're looking at this Goomba is find out what are the current parts and pieces of this, and are they going to hold up all the way through the creation of our Goomba. To give you an insight to that, no. There are some parts and pieces that we're going to hang on to, but we are going to be adjusting the basic components of this prefab to get it to work for what we want it to do eventually. There are going to be some issues that we may run into. We may have to change up our collision box or add different parts and pieces to it. But to get us started, this is going to be a good starting point for our prefab. Go ahead and close up our rigid body and our box collider. Now on this prefab, we're going to notice that we've got our mesh filter, our mesh renderer, we've got an animation set up, and we've got our anim sprite script. So our anim sprite script, as you have used before in previous prefabs, it's going to allow us to call up and work with the animations for our character. And below that, we've got our enemy Goomba script. So our enemy Goomba script, we've already got it loaded up over here in the Unity script editor. And we've added a header to this. Basically, it's going to be our Goomba controller. And go ahead and type in for yourself the author. And the description, we're basically going to control the component. Is a control component for the enemy Goomba. It's going to control its logic and some options and some properties of the Goomba. So we're going to be working initially by creating some of the variables that we're going to be using inside of the script and fleshing out some of the functions that we think we're going to want to work with to make the Goomba do what it's supposed to do. And while we do this, we're always going to refer back to just the design of the Goomba and the things that we're trying to implement inside of the Goomba. So as we go to our enemy Goomba, we've got our header set up, we've got a function update. Let's go ahead and just jump up here, give ourselves a little more space. And what we want to do is start off with a couple of the basics. We want some variables that are going to be used by the designer to be able to change the speed, the height, even an attack move speed that we can use, the states of the Goomba, and as well as the attack range and the search range that we want to use for our Goomba in here. We also want to be able to load up those targets, so we're going to need some sort of transform to load up, and some force options to apply a force. So let's start off by just setting up some variables. We'll start off with a variable for our movement speed. So we'll do a move speed. And let's set this one to a float. And as a float, we'll just start it off, let's say somewhere around 20. This might be a good speed. It might not be a good speed. But we'll see as we start working with it. So we're going to set the speed of the Goomba. Another variable that we can look at using, we're going to be having an attack move speed. Now what do we need an attack move speed for? As the enemy gets closer to our player, we want him to speed up a little bit just to intensify that moment. And then we've got additional variables. Let's say for our jump, we want our Goomba to be able to jump into the air. So we're going to have a jump speed. And we could call this a jump height if we wanted to. Again, we'll set it to a float. And let's make this equal to, what do we think? Let's do something sort of low to get started with. We'll do somewhere around 3. This is going to be our jump height. Next up, we can start looking at some of the states that the player can be in. And this is a good chance just to use an enumeration. So we'll use an enum, E-N-U-M. And with this one, we're going to do a gumba state. And our gumba state can be what? Well, he can be, we'll go ahead and just tie these off to keep it similar with the others. We'll keep it in a row. We're going to move left. We're going to move right. And if we're just going back and forth, we've got our move left, move right, our move stop, air, die, and go home. So our move left, move right, our move stop, our jump in the air, our enemy die, and our go home. This will set up the Goomba state. And then we want to go ahead and set the starting state for the Goomba state. And as an additional setup inside of a JavaScript, we can also set these to the variable, so we can make this equal to 0, which is the first one inside of this little array. We can set this one to 1, to 2, to 3, 4, and 5. And for our Goomba state, we'll make another variable, and we'll expose these for right now. We don't necessarily need these at the end, but they will help inside of our inspector as we work on this, just to be able to see and make sure that the Goomba is in the state that he's supposed to be in. So here we'll do our Goomba state, and this is going to equal our Goomba state dot what. And we could say, let's start him off. If we're looking at him right now, the best direction for him to move is going to be to the left. So we'll start him off in our move left. We'll set the starting state. Now, another option that we want to look at is going to be an attack range and a search range. If we go back to this, we can see we've got something for searching and attacking, and the radius that we're going to use for that. So we'll create a variable for, let's say, our attack range. And for this, let's just make this float variable. And what do we think it's going to be? Again, when you're setting up these initial values, it's really a bit of a guess, but we do need something to get us started. And we'll do a search range, and again a float variable. And the search range, we can bump this up just a little bit more than what we're currently dealing with. And after our search range and our attack range, we're going to be looking for, let's say, a return home range. How far from a central point is our Goomba allowed to go before he actually returns home? So we could create eventually a game object that represents sort of a home position, and how far from that home position is he allowed to go. So just sort of a secondary value to control the distance that this object is allowed to go. So here, we could call this one just our return home range. And again, a float variable. And we'll make this one equal to something a little bit bigger than what we've got so far. We'll go maybe just a 4.0. And we will see how that one works out. And to set this up, let's say we've got our attack range. This is going to be something to set our range to for the speed increase when he attacks, and then the search range, of course, is just the range for finding the player. And then we've got that return home range, and that one is just set the range before the enemy player has to return back to patrol. Okay, so that gives us a handful of good variables here. Now, the other things we want to do is we want to load in that chase target, and we want to load in that home position that we're going to be using. So let's set up two variables for that. We'll do our chase target. And of course, you can name these anything you want to name them. We'll do a transform. And with our transform, we're going to say, let's load up the player target, because that's what we want to put into that variable. And then we're also going to have our home position, or we could do a home target if we want to be consistent. We'll do our transform, and from here we're going to be loading up the home position. Okay, so this is going to give our chase target our home position. The other thing that we're going to look at is a force that we want to apply from the player, from the enemy, when Mario comes over. Mario jumps up in the air. He's going to jump. He's going to run over to the Goomba and land on his head and then bounce off in the air. So that's that action that we want to occur. To do that, we're going to have to apply a force, have some sort of variable that says how hard is he going to push this character off of him. Now, for us, because we are doing a clone of a game, a lot of these things have sort of been answered for us. We know that this is the action that we want to happen. When you're starting to develop something from scratch, these are things that you have to come up with on your own, as you're developing that idea. How does that interaction happen? What is that interaction? For us, we know it's going to be this force that pushes the character off, so we could call this just our death force. And for the death force, it's just going to be a float variable. And what do we want to make this float equal to? This is, again, a tough one to call, but we'll go ahead and say somewhere around 3. And what basically is happening here, when the player jumps on me, then bounce him up or force him off, X amount. Okay. And then the other thing that we want to look at, that's going to be probably one more of the exposed variables inside of the inspector. We do want to look at creating some GUI editor tools that sort of help us visualize the range and the radius that this character is able to see. Whether we're drawing a ray inside of the scene or a circular object around him that gives us an idea of some of the ranges or the radiuses that we're going to be using here, it's going to help us just as we start to work with the game and sort of debug the game. But one thing that we don't want to do is have it on all the time. So we're going to need some sort of variable to turn on and off some GUI options that we're going to work with down the road. So we'll set one up for our gizmo on, or let's just call it our gizmo toggle. And because it's toggle, this is a boolean. And let's only do one boolean here. And what would we like this boolean to equal in the beginning? Let's just set it to true. Alright, that sets us up for that one, and this is going to toggle the display debug radius. Alright, that gets us set up pretty good. One thing we can do before we move on is go ahead and just clean up some of the code. Depends on how you like to set it up. When we look at it here, it's a little bit hard to read. We're going through it and we're back and forth and back and forth. One thing that we do want to try to do is line code up in a way that's, or format it in a way that's a little more readable as we work with it. This will help us in the long run, and it definitely helps others when they have to come in and view the code that you've been working on. It makes it a lot easier for them to get in and comment on it and find out what's going on. So if we set something up like this, then we can drop our comments a couple of tabs over. If we'll do this just as we're working on it, it'll make it nice and easy and keep our code good and clean. Alright, so that's going to get us started. The next thing we're going to look at are some of the possible private variables that we're going to use, and then we're going to start setting up the functions inside of this component.